The modern political history of the Middle East has been dominated by authoritarian rulers. None were more notorious than Saddam Hussein. An enigmatic leader with a penchant for doing things his way, Saddam led Iraq across conflicting fates. In the 1970s, the country was the envy of all of its neighbors. But by the 1990s, it was amongst the poorest and most deprived in the world. To highlight his complexity, both instances were created by him. In order to understand him, we will track his entire life story, from his impoverished childhood, where he suffered at the hands of his abusive stepfather, to his entry on the Iraqi political scene as an assassin. We need to take an in-depth look to make sense of how a man who transformed Iraq into a thriving and developing society could throw it all away by waging 2 wars back-to-back with his neighbors. We will see how a man that held an entire nation hostage to his will and brought it to ruin could now be revered and remembered fondly by many in the region. This is the life and times of Saddam Hussein. According to official records, Saddam was born in 1937 amidst incredibly challenging conditions. His home outside the city of Tikrit was a mud hut with no running water, no electricity, and scarce food. Saddam's name means one who confronts, and from the very beginning, the little boy learned to confront harsh challenges. Chief among those challenges was the fact that Saddam's father had died before he was born. His early years were shaped by his cruel and exacting stepfather. Hassan Dalaya, what he was locally known as, would often beat his stepson with an asphalt-covered stick. To escape the incessant abuse at home, Saddam sought the friendship of neighboring children. But being fatherless carried a heavy stigma, and the other kids teased and ridiculed him relentlessly. To defend himself from bullies, little Saddam started carrying an iron bar whenever he left the family hut. Like stepfather, like son. In this harsh environment, a sense of self-reliance and suspicion began to form the contours of Saddam's personality. Cruelty germinated within the boy. The world was cruel, why should he be any different? Saddam would be rescued from his life of poverty when he was 10 years old and sent to live with his uncle Khairullah Talfa in Tikrit. He was a school teacher and former army officer who had just been released from prison for his participation in the 1941 anti-British nationalist revolt of Rashid al-Gaylani. Under his tutelage, Saddam learned to read, write, and spell his own name. He also learned about Iraq's complicated and contentious place on the world stage. World War I had brought an end to 400 years of Ottoman domination of the Middle East. The victorious allies, France and Great Britain, were quick to dismantle the empire and carve up the Middle Eastern territories for themselves. The borders of modern-day Iraq were created by Europeans to serve the interests of Europeans, with little thought given to the entrenched rivalries and bitter tensions between the tribes and ethnic groups in the region. Iraq had gained its independence from Britain in 1932 as a result of a very strong nationalist movement inside of the country. But this independence was nominal at best, since the British still controlled the country's foreign affairs and oil supply. This fostered huge resentment amongst most sectors of Iraqi society at the British lack of respect for Iraq's sovereignty. Iraqi nationalists were given an opportunity to free themselves from the shackles of imperialism with the start of World War II. Led by Rashid Ali Gaylani, the nationalists sought to counterbalance the British by aligning themselves with Germany, subsequently seizing power in a coup on April 1, 1941. But Iraq and its resources were too important to the Allied war effort to let this happen. So a month later, the British invaded the country and occupied it once again. In 1948, the Iraqi government tried to sign a revision of the 1930 Anglo-Iraqi Treaty, which would have seen British influence inside the country continue. but the Iraqi people rose up and showed their displeasure in the subsequent Al-Wathba uprising. In 1952, the Iraqi Intifada took place, with widespread strikes and protests calling for an end to the British presence in the country, and some even calling for King Faisal to resign. Prominent thinkers such as Sati al-Husri had used his position as Director of General Education in the 1920s to allow pan-Arab beliefs to seep into the very fabric of the education system. From the 1940s onwards, there emerged a trend amongst educated military officers politicized by nationalism who subsequently tried to vie for power. This trend was only encouraged by the success of the Egyptian Free Officers Group that spearheaded the 1952 revolution. When its leader, Jamal Abdel Nasser, followed that up with a victory in the Suez Crisis of 1956, the Arab world's imagination was set on fire. In Nasser, the Iraqi nationalists saw a symbol that they could emulate, leading politically conscious military officers to organize and model themselves after Nasser's free officer movement. It was within this tumultuous environment that a teenage Saddam Hussein experienced his political awakening. In 1955, Saddam moved with his uncle to the capital Baghdad. Under the influence of his uncle Khairullah, Saddam became a supporter of the Ba'ath Party. Small in size but potent in purpose, the Ba'ath Party was a secular organization whose main goals included the unification of Arab nations under one banner and the elimination of imperialist influence over the Middle East. Like most Iraqis, Saddam came to resent the British colonial intrusion of their nation, their monopolization of Iraq's oil resources, and the local lackeys that peddled their propaganda. He sought to make himself useful to the Ba'athist cause, but the poorly educated country boy wasn't much of an intellectual, so he served as street muscle for the local party cells by participating in anti-government demonstrations and forming a gang that prowled the suburbs and intimidated shop owners. The Hashemite monarchy, for its part, had tried to undermine the popularity of these populist ideologies by promising land reforms and greater rights to its citizens. The government's position had been strengthened by the fact that it was receiving more and more money thanks to its oil revenue. But for many in the country, these reforms were not enough, and it was hard to argue with them. Almost all of the wealth generated from oil went directly to the British or a small group of Iraqi elites. Iraq's increasing prosperity could not stop the spirit of rebellion, and everything would change on July 14, 1958. At the beginning of the year, the Hashemite monarchies of Jordan and Iraq formed the Arab Federation, a confederation that was supposed to rival Egypt and Syria's merger into the United Arab Republic that same year. Later that summer, Jordan's King Hussein requested his cousin Faisal of Iraq to send military units to Jordan for fear of a Syrian attack. The Iraqi free officers saw this as the perfect opportunity to strike. The secret group's leader, Abdul Karim Qasim, a high-ranking army officer, decided against marching to the Jordanian border and instead turned on Baghdad, seizing the capital. The coup was effective, but it did set a bloody precedent for the future of political transitions in the country. Since much of the royal family was executed, including King Faisal and his uncle, the former regent Abdullah, Prime Minister Nouri al-Said tried to escape dressed as a woman in an abaya, but was caught and shot. Prince Abdullah and Prime Minister Said's bodies were then mutilated and dragged through the streets of Baghdad by the angry mob. The new revolutionary government under Prime Minister Qasim had come to power with a message that cut across political factions. Whilst this helped in terms of giving it greater popularity, it also provided it with a lack of direction and ideological structure. Two main strands of thought emerged in this confused atmosphere. One, supported by Qasim and the Iraqi Communist Party, focused on a Wataniya or Iraq First policy, whilst another, espoused by pro-Nasserists and the Ba'athist Party, wanted Qawmiya or pan-Arab policies. The latter sought to unite with Nasser's United Arab Republic, whilst Qasim and his supporters wanted to put Iraq first and foremost. General Qasim, keen to preserve his newly acquired power, shunned the pan-Arabic aspirations of the Baathists. This enraged the Baathists, who felt they had been betrayed. No sooner had General Qasim taken the reins of power than he too was marked for death. To carry out the deed, the Baathists needed a triggerman. A hit squad was formed around Saddam, and meticulous plans were made to carry out the assassination on October 7, 1959 in the capital. But when the big day came, Saddam and his conspirators forgot the carefully choreographed plan and began spraying shots wildly into the street. A short gunfight ensued in which one of the assassins was killed, Qasim took a bullet in the shoulder and arm, and young Saddam was shot in the leg. He escaped to Cairo, Egypt, waiting for the day he could return. That day came 3 years later in February 1963. A Baathist-aligned coup, likely with CIA involvement, took control of the Iraqi government by overthrowing and executing General Qasim. Upon his return to Iraq, Saddam married his first cousin, Sajida Talfa, the daughter of Uncle Khairallah. As Saddam's family was growing, so too did his political ambitions. His uncle's old friend, Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr, had become the prime minister of the country and actively pursued a policy of nepotism by appointing fellow Tikritis to important positions, so he took Saddam under his wing as a bodyguard and confidant. But later that year, there was another coup as President Abdul Salam Arif purged the Baathist party from the government on account of their infighting. Less than a year later, Saddam found himself behind bars, credibly accused of a plot against the government. He spent 2 years imprisoned before staging a daring escape in 1966. The Baathists were already plotting their return to power, and in the summer of 1968, they struck. The so-called July Revolution was the fourth coup of its kind in less than a decade. Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr, Saddam Hussein's mentor and benefactor, was named president of the new regime, and he brought his energetic protege along for the ride. By the age of 31, Saddam was essentially the second most powerful person in Iraq. As the Deputy Secretary of the Revolutionary Command Council, he appointed political commissars within the officers' corps that bypassed the chain of command and reported directly to him. With the military firmly in his grip, Saddam set his sights on the Iraqi population itself, as he transformed the country into a totalitarian police state. Iraqi prisons were soon overflowing with screaming detainees, but back at home, Saddam's house was filled with the sound of giggling children. By 1972, Saddam and Sajida had 5 kids, 2 sons and 3 daughters. As a result, many Iraqi citizens looked at Saddam and saw a committed family man. In reality, Saddam spent very little time at home, preferring the company of sycophants and informants as he held court in opulent Baghdadi nightclubs. He developed a taste for tailored suits, expensive cars, and rich food. But as Saddam's waistline expanded, so too did his visions for the country. These visions would be funded by oil money. Iraq has some of the most abundant oil and natural gas fields on the planet. But from its discovery in 1927, the revenue from it flowed out of the country, as the British-run IPC, the Iraq Petroleum Company, had secured exclusive rights to drill for the black gold liquid. Previous Iraqi governments had tried and failed to reclaim its financial sovereignty, but it was Saddam Hussein who succeeded when he concluded a deal to nationalize the IPC in 1972. That sudden windfall allowed the government to spend huge amounts of money on social programs, construction projects, welfare, and education. For the first time in a long time, life was getting better for people in Iraq. And with great wealth came the need to protect it. He signed a dizzying series of armed deals with foreign countries throughout the 1970s. In the span of just a few years, Iraq's military became a formidable, fully modern force. Saddam's nationalization of the oil industry, modernization of the military, and expansion of social infrastructure turned him into a superstar. As his television appearances became ubiquitous, the foundations of his cult of personality were starting to form. It was an open secret that Saddam Hussein was substantially more popular than President al-Bakr himself. By the late 1970s, Saddam believed his old mentor had been a useful figurehead, but now that he had attained full control over the military, the party, and the state security, Saddam no longer had a need for the aging patriarch. So, on the evening of July 16, 1979, Saddam Hussein visited President al-Bakr at the presidential palace. There he gave al-Bakr an ultimatum: step aside or else. Saddam was now the new Iraqi president at just 42 years of age. To ensure the longevity of his new regime, he would need to purge the Ba'ath Party of anybody who stood in his way. So on July 2, 1979, less than a week after al-Bakr's resignation, Saddam called a meeting of all the senior Ba'ath Party leadership. There, he told them that he had uncovered a plot against the government by party members who were inside the building. One of the alleged leaders of the conspiracy, the ex-president's secretary who happened to be tortured beforehand, then read out 68 names of party members that were apparently involved in the plot. Over the next few weeks, these men were tried and sentences were given out, with many set to be executed. But no sooner had he achieved absolute power and prosperity than it began to slowly turn to ash in his palms. In the 1970s, Iran was a modernizing nation on the rise. Its huge oil reserves brought an influx of cash which was then used to rapidly develop the country. Its longtime ruler, Mohammad Reza Shah, wanted Iran to recapture its past glory after seeing it be at the prey of European imperial powers for over a century. So he quickly sought to modernize the country's military. Spending billions of dollars, the Shah bought advanced weaponry and equipment from countries like the USA and UK. With its vast array of tanks, state-of-the-art fighter jets, and impressive warships, Iran was well on its way to becoming one of the world's most powerful military forces. Regionally, it became the preeminent power in the Middle East, thanks to its GDP and military. But beneath this picturesque surface, the country faced serious fundamental issues. Despite the massive windfall from oil, Iran's newfound wealth was only available to a select class as a result of the rampant nepotism that plagued the government. Those who were favored by the regime received lucrative contracts and positions facilitated by the oil boom. At the same time, the traditional forces within society were alienated by the Shah's ardent support for Iran's westernization. In 1978, tensions boiled over as huge protests, led by the ulama, started gathering momentum. From his exile, Ayatollah Khomeini soon emerged as the leader of the anti-regime movement. In a remarkable sequence of events, the Shah stepped down at the beginning of 1979, being replaced by Khomeini. The new supreme leader of Iran announced that the country was to be a theocracy, ruled by the ulama itself. As his emerging neighbor Iran was plunged into revolutionary frenzy, Saddam would watch with keen interest. He, like much of the ruling elite, was Sunni Muslim. Despite being excluded from the halls of power, Shia Muslims actually held a demographic majority. Therefore, the ascension of the Ayatollahs to power in Iran particularly worried Saddam about the prospect of his own Shia Iraqis rising up against him, especially since Khomeini championed the exportation of his revolutionary ideals abroad. The roots of the danger lay in Iraq's demographics. Despite being ruled by an entrenched Sunni minority, Iraq's population was predominantly Shia. For years, the Shia had been excluded from the halls of power, and they harbored bitter resentments about the discrimination they endured under the Sunni tribal elite. The Iraqi leader took this threat to his survival very seriously. In addition, the two countries had a long-standing feud over the Shatt al-Arab waterway at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. In 1975, Saddam had personally been involved in the Algiers Agreement, which saw Iraq concede its right to the waterway to the Shah. but he had signed this largely to put an end to the Kurdish rebellion within Iraq, which was sustained by Iranian support for the Kurds. Iran's new government may have been crackling with revolutionary zeal, but militarily they were weak. Saddam saw his opportunity to strangle the Ayatollah's threatening vision in its crib. As a result, on September 22, 1980, squadrons of Iraqi fighters swarmed into Iranian airspace and attacked a collection of bases near Tehran. The Iran-Iraq War had begun. Saddam had envisioned his air attack would have the same effect as the Israeli strikes did in the Six-Day War of 1967. Upon securing aerial superiority, he believed Iraqi victory would be swift and inevitable. Unfortunately for him, this did not materialize. The aerial attack was unsuccessful, only doing partial damage to the air bases and destroying an insignificant number of aircraft. Nevertheless, Saddam launched a ground invasion the very next day, attacking in 3 separate locations in the north, center, and south. Much of the Iraqi manpower was dedicated to the southern attack, which targeted Iran's Arab-dominated Khuzestan province, in the process fully securing the Shatt al-Arab. Almost immediately, the Khuzestani cities of Khorramshahr and Abadan were besieged. Both sieges would be protracted and delayed the Iraqi offensive, thus giving Iran sufficient time to stabilize and calculate its strategy. Although Khorramshahr would be captured by the end of October, the Iraqi offensive was seriously delayed by outnumbered Iranian units who fought tooth and nail to defend the city. Abadan, the site of the famous refinery, took even longer, with the siege being dragged out until September 1981 and ending in an Iranian victory. Right from the get-go, Saddam was surprised by the Iranian response. Considering the political turbulence the country had experienced in the previous few years, he had almost assumed Iran would wither from the pressure of an external attack and internal upheaval from ordinary Iranians. Instead, what he found was a disjointed nation that was galvanized by a foreign aggressor. Domestically, Ayatollah Khomeini was facing serious threats from all directions. The MEK were launching attacks on high-ranking members of the regime. Even amongst the ulama, there was dissension with Khomeini's strict vision. Segments of Iranian society itself was becoming alienated with the Islamic Republic as it slowly realized it had replaced one dictator in the Shah with another in Khomeini. But rather than capitulating, Ayatollah Khomeini saw an opportunity to secure his Islamic revolution. The military investments made by the Shah in the previous few decades meant that the country still retained fairly sophisticated weaponry. The Iranian response was decisive. In fact, just 2 hours after the initial Iraqi airstrike, Iranian fighter jets responded with their own attack. 2 months later, in November, Operation Revered prevented Iraqi dominance over the Persian Gulf and destroyed much of the Iraqi navy. This meant Iraq could not entirely blockade the port of Abadan, allowing Iran to resupply it by sea and thereby directly contributing to the siege's eventual failure. From early 1981 onwards, Iraqi offensives essentially stalled. In January of that year, it was Iran's turn to go on the offensive, launching Operation Nasr. The brainchild of President Bani Sadr, it was intended to drive the Iraqis out of Khuzestan. But internal turmoil within the new Iranian government meant that the operation would end up becoming a disastrous failure. Upon ascending to power, Khomeini had purged the military of officers whose loyalties he doubted. Countless senior officers were imprisoned, executed, or fled abroad. At the same time, he had established the Sepah Pastaran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, to ensure the protection of the Islamic Republic. This resulted in a rivalry between the army and the IRGC. To further confound matters, this rivalry took shape politically as the moderate President Bani Sadr supported the army, whilst more hardliner members of the government supported the Revolutionary Guards. So when Operation Nasr failed, it set off a chain of events within Iran. Bani Sadr's opponents were emboldened, soon after impeaching him in June 1981. Knowing firsthand what happened to those who fell afoul of the regime, Bani Sadr decided to flee the country. From this point on, Iran's government was unified under Islamist hardliners who would intensify their grip on power over the next few years by eliminating all rivals. From 1980 to 1983, the regime launched the Cultural Revolution, seeking to root out nonconformist thought amongst institutions of higher education. Universities were shut down for this period, students and teachers were purged. Dissident groups like the MEK would fight back by unleashing a wave of high-profile attacks on prominent figures of the regime. An attack on the Prime Minister's office in August 1981 left both the new president Rajai and Prime Minister Bahunar dead. Even the current supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was the target of an assassination attempt a few months earlier in June 1981. The MEK would go on to collaborate with Saddam from 1983 onwards. This revolutionary crisis mode would come to pass by 1983, and it was to benefit Iran's war effort against Iraq. The rivalry between the army and the IRGC would also dissipate, thereby making coordinated attacks between the two branches of the military smoother. Already by May 1982, Saddam's forces had been driven out of Iranian land. Saddam did not have a military background. Regardless, he decided to play soldier and micromanage the war effort. Virtually all decisions had to be funneled through Saddam, resulting in a paralyzing bottleneck. Iraqi soldiers died by the tens of thousands because of their strategically inept commander-in-chief. Due to the culture of fear he had created, nobody dared question his decision-making. To counter the bad news from the front, Saddam sought to insulate the Iraqi civilian population from the uglier realities of war. Using the oil wealth he had accumulated, the dictator spent billions of dollars importing commodities to avoid shortages. Creating a false sense of normalcy and prosperity, it was all part of a larger pattern by Saddam to build an inescapable cult of personality. Iraqi citizens lived in a world where Saddam's image was as constant as the sun in the sky. At this point, Saddam's strategy changed from holding territory within Iran to not losing any within Iraq. Immediately, he tried to sue for peace. But Khomeini was uninterested, seeing the benefits the war had brought for his regime. The Iranians did, however, have a major problem on their hands. Ever since the hostage crisis of 1979, they had been facing severe international sanctions from the US and its allies. This meant replacing weapon parts was extremely difficult, an issue they sought to fix by cannibalizing parts from other machinery and turning to the black market. To highlight the complexity of geopolitics, Israel became one of the biggest suppliers of arms to Iran during the war. The Israelis first got permission from the Americans for these arms sales, which totaled to tens of billions of dollars. When Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin launched an attack on Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor in 1981, it was done with Iranian intelligence. So even though publicly the Ayatollahs maintained an antagonistic stance towards Israel, and despite America publicly supporting the sanctions on Iran, through backdoor means they did the opposite. The US also secretly sold arms to Iran. In 1986, the Iran-Contra affair came to light and shocked the world. Under the Reagan administration, America had been selling weapons to Iran and using the funds to finance the Nicaraguan Contras, right-wing rebels fighting against the Marxist Sandinista government. This was all the more embarrassing because of Operation Staunch in 1983, where the US tried to diplomatically pressure other countries not to sell Iran arms. Besides these clandestine transactions, Iran mainly relied on China, Libya, and Syria for support in arms and logistical equipment. Iraq, on the other hand, received much more international support. Around the time that the war moved from Iranian to Iraqi soil, the oil-rich Gulf countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia started providing Saddam with massive loans, fearing Tehran's warlike and revolutionary regime would harm their own interests. Syria was one of the only Arab countries to stand behind Iran, shutting down the Kirkuk-Banias pipeline from 1982 onwards, resulting in a catastrophic loss of capital for Saddam, losing billions of dollars every month. But support from the Gulf countries prevented Iraq from bankruptcy, with some estimating Saudi loans alone to be $1 billion per month. In addition, Saddam also received a lot of support from the USSR and Western countries such as France and West Germany. In 1982, America normalized relations with Iraq and went on to provide the Iraqi dictator with military intelligence as well as selling arms to him. It was crucial for US interests in the Middle East for Iraq to not lose the war, because it would destabilize neighboring countries which had pro-American governments, not to mention the massive impact an Iranian victory would have on the oil industry. Iran's invasion of Iraq convinced Saddam that he had to pursue a policy of total war, gearing the entire society for Iraq's defense. So he drafted even more soldiers into both the regular Iraqi army and the Iraqi Popular Army, a paramilitary force consisting of civilian volunteers. At the start of the war, Iran held a clear manpower advantage, but by 1984, the forces were equal in numbers. Just 2 years later, Iraq's forces were significantly higher than their foe, and by the end of the war in 1988, Iraq's army numbered 1 million soldiers, perhaps more, whilst Iran had almost half that number. Saddam used this numerical advantage by employing a defense-in-depth strategy, creating multiple lines of defense that intended to bleed the Iranians through attrition. This was especially effective against the Iranian strategy of human wave attacks, whereby their infantry would try to overwhelm Iraqi defense lines with sheer numbers. Once parity in army sizes was reached, these attacks were favored less by the Iranian high command anyway. The Iranian objective was to break the Iraqi resolve to fight, but buoyed by funding and weapons from the West and the Gulf monarchies, Iraq remained resolute. Even when the Iranians teamed up with the Peshmerga, the Iraqi Kurdish resistance movement, to open up a new front in the north, the deadlock could not be broken. From 1982 until 1988, the conflict consisted of constant Iranian offensives that were rebuffed by a determined Iraqi defense. Unconventional warfare became normalized as the two sides settled into a World War I-like trench warfare. Both sides began targeting civilians, with their air forces attacking major cities from the opposing side in order to terrorize the civilian population. From 1984 onwards, the two countries began targeting each other's ability to export oil in the Persian Gulf, as the global financial system watched nervously. By 1987, American warships intervened by escorting Kuwaiti tankers which were being attacked by the Iranians. Saddam also gave the green light for the use of chemical weapons, with his close relationship to the USA emboldening him to do so without fear of consequences. The most deadly usage of these came just before the war ended, when Saddam decided to address the Kurds living in the north. Accusing them of being a fifth column for collaborating with Iran, he unleashed a brutal campaign against them in 1987. The height of this operation was in March 1988 in the town of Halabja, where Iraqi planes dropped chemical munitions on defenseless inhabitants who could not outrun the roiling clouds of gas. In a single day, 5,000 men, women and children were killed, 10,000 more were injured. Whilst it did earn him the ire of the international community, the Kurds were pacified for the time being. Saddam could now turn his attention back to the Iranian front. By 1988, Iran was exhausted, unable to keep up with Iraq and its powerful allies. By July of that year, Saddam's forces had reversed the small Iranian gains within the country. The key southern port city of Basra, which had been besieged multiple times, was now out of danger. Later that month, Khomeini begrudgingly accepted a ceasefire, and by August 1988, the war was over. Up to 1 million Iraqis and Iranians were dead, 700,000 were injured. Neither side gained any territory or anything else for that matter, but both sides lost a great deal. For Iran, whilst the war solidified the Ayatollah's grip on power, they had lost human capital as well as a tremendous amount of money, which was compounded by the heavy sanctions already placed on them from the international community. For Iraq, it had entered the war as a rapidly modernizing country that was the envy of most of its neighbors, but now found itself as yet another war-torn third world country. Cost estimates for rebuilding the country's infrastructure hovered at over $200 billion, a staggering amount that Iraq's annual oil revenues of $13 billion could never hope to alleviate. To make matters worse, the loans given to Iraq by its rich Gulf neighbors were going to be recalled, meaning that it was now going to face bankruptcy. By 1990, Iraq's financial difficulties in the wake of the Iran-Iraq War had not improved. As foreign debts to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait loomed, the Iraqi people were getting impatient with their leaders' broken promises and empty propaganda. New plots against the dictator's life were being uncovered at an alarming rate. Saddam's only hope of slipping the economic noose was to convince the Gulf sheikhs to forgive the debt. In his view, Iraq had acted as their shield against the Ayatollah's revolution. While Iraqis suffered and died, the sheikhs lounged in relative safety. After 8 years of crippling war, letting him off the hook was the least they could do. But they were unmoved by Saddam's pleas. The Gulf states refused to forgive the debt. Being spurned by the sheikhs flared Saddam's violent temper, and his anger quickly settled on one country in particular, Kuwait. The small Gulf country was no stranger to Iraqi claims over its territory. Towards the end of the 19th century, influence over Kuwait was contested by the Ottomans and the British. The latter won out, controlling the foreign policy for the ruling Sabah family. Prior to this, Kuwait had fallen under the nominal authority of the Ottoman Vilayat of Basra in modern-day southern Iraq. As Iraq itself became a state in the aftermath of World War I and the fragmentation of the Ottoman Empire, it tried to assert its irredentist claims over its small neighbor numerous times, especially after oil was discovered in the 1930s. As recently as 1961, a few weeks after its full independence from Britain, Kuwait was threatened with invasion by the then Iraqi Prime Minister Abdul Karim Qasim. The anticipated invasion was only averted after the British sent their own forces in. But this did not put an end to Iraqi irredentism. For many in the country, Iraq contained 18 provinces. Kuwait was the long absent 19th. So in the early months of 1990, when the Kuwaiti Emir refused to forgive Iraq's debts, it was like salt in the wound. Adding to the consternation was the fact that Kuwait had been exceeding oil production limits set by OPEC, which drove the price per barrel down considerably. For a country like Iraq, whose economy was entirely dependent on oil revenues, the price drop made economic recovery almost impossible. Saddam threatened the Kuwaitis, saying that they were conducting economic warfare against him. The Kuwaitis responded obstinately, saying they would not cave to extortion. Tensions continued to escalate when Saddam deployed 30,000 troops to the Kuwaiti border on July 21st. It was an alarming show of force, but most in the international community assumed the dictator was bluffing in an attempt to bully the Kuwaitis into acquiescence. Saddam, however, was not bluffing. On August 2nd, 1990, the Iraqi army invaded Kuwait. Eight years of war against Iran had hardened the Iraqi military into a formidable force. With over 1 million men, thousands of tanks, and a wide array of artillery and aircraft at his disposal, Saddam Hussein commanded the fourth largest army in the world. Kuwait never stood a chance. In less than 24 hours, the Kuwaiti army, a token force of 14,000 men, had completely collapsed. The Kuwaiti Emir and his family fled for their lives to neighboring Saudi Arabia in a convoy of Mercedes-Benz limousines. In one swift stroke, Saddam had returned a branch to the root, annexing the 19th province and gaining direct control of over 20% of the world's oil supplies. From his palace in Baghdad, the dictator was jubilant, but his invasion of Kuwait would not go unanswered. The international community was outraged. Within a matter of hours, the United Nations had passed a resolution calling for the unconditional withdrawal of Saddam's army from Kuwait. An embargo against Iraqi oil was implemented, economic sanctions were imposed, and Kuwait's financial assets were frozen to deny Iraq their use. It was an extreme reaction, one Saddam thought he had guarded himself against. A week before the invasion, he'd met with the US ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, to gauge what America's response would be to a potential attack on Kuwait. Glaspie had told Saddam that the United States had no opinion on Arab-Arab conflicts, which he interpreted as a subtle nudge that an invasion would not result in any serious response. When he left the meeting with Glaspie, Saddam believed that he had received the green light. After all, Iraq had enjoyed the patronage and partnership of the Americans for years. Surely they would not rally in defense of a tiny, insignificant nation like Kuwait. He was wrong. George H.W. Bush, the President of the United States, vowed to evict the Iraqi army from Kuwait, one way or another. In invading Kuwait, Saddam had crossed a line with the Americans. They were willing to arm him, pay him, and use him as a regional pawn, but they were not willing to tolerate a new status quo where he controlled 1/5 of the world's oil supplies. Bush quickly dispatched his Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, to broker a deal with the Saudis to allow the deployment of United States troops to the kingdom. Fearing that the Iraqi army might cross the border in an attempt to capture Saudi oil fields as well, King Fahd agreed to open his airports to US troops. Within a matter of days, American soldiers were walking off planes in Riyadh, the first stage of a massive defense mobilization that came to be known as Operation Desert Shield. Back in Washington, D.C., the crisis in Kuwait had taken on a distinctly moral dimension for President George H.W. Bush. He came to believe that Iraq's annexation of Kuwait was akin to Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor or Germany's invasion of Poland, a treacherous breach of international law by a bloodthirsty dictator. Bush was soon directly comparing Saddam to the German leader in World War II, believing that appeasing such a tyrant would set a frightening precedent and embolden other autocrats around the world. To oppose Saddam, Bush began assembling a massive international coalition. Stalwart allies like the United Kingdom, Canada, and Japan joined eagerly, and after some strategically deployed bribes, Arab nations like Egypt and Syria joined the club. Even the Soviet Union and China agreed to stand aside, refusing to support Saddam in his quixotic misadventure. In the end, around 40 nations signed on to Bush's coalition. Saddam Hussein quickly realized the gravity of his miscalculation. He had made an enemy of the world's last remaining superpower, joined by virtually the entire international community. In essence, it was Iraq against the world. Saddam, however, was defiant. To gain leverage over the coalition, he kept thousands of foreign workers in Kuwait as hostages, using them as human shields to deter any potential attack. It was a cruel, impulsive stunt, and all it succeeded in doing was deepening the world's contempt for him. In December of 1990, all of the hostages had been returned home. By the end of the year, it was clear that nothing short of direct military action would pry Kuwait out of Saddam's grip. The United Nations passed Resolution 678, which authorized the use of all necessary means to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait. The resolution gave Saddam Hussein a final deadline of January 15, 1991 to pull his troops out. If he refused, the coalition would attack. The deadline came and went, and on January 17, 1991, the coalition launched a massive assault on Iraq and occupied Kuwait. Operation Desert Storm, as it came to be known, began with a blistering air offensive on Baghdad itself. Hundreds of planes dropped thousands of bombs onto the capital, and as the city went dim, block by block, Iraqi citizens braced themselves for the days ahead. For 6 weeks, the coalition's air forces rained death on Saddam's army and Iraq's cities. Using cutting-edge hardware like smart bombs and laser-guided missiles, American planes pummeled the country night after night. In the Western media, the accuracy of these weapons was lavishly overhyped, portrayed as surgical and bloodless, but the cold truth was that they often resulted in civilian casualties. It seemed as if Saddam's main offensive strategy was to target the oil fields of Kuwait. Iraqi soldiers set over 600 oil wells and lakes on fire as they retreated from the advance of the US-led forces. But this scorched earth policy was not very effective in slowing the coalition forces down. Meanwhile, American jets devastated Iraq's infrastructure. Water treatment plants, electrical grids, sewage systems, bridges, and other vital public works were left in ruins, imposing immense physical hardships on the Iraqi civilian population. On February 24th, satisfied that Iraq had been sufficiently weakened by the air campaign, the coalition moved its ground forces into Iraq and Kuwait. The Iraqi army, deflated and demoralized by weeks of air raids and bombing runs, simply melted away. Tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers surrendered to the advancing coalition forces, dispelling American fears of high casualties and Vietnam-style attrition. The rout reached its bloody apex at a 6-lane highway north of Kuwait City. Hundreds of Iraqi soldiers, fleeing north in stolen civilian vehicles and military transports, were trapped in a bottleneck by coalition jets and massacred. The Highway of Death, as it came to be known, was seen as an excessive case of butchery by the world's press, and under pressure from within and without, the Bush administration made the decision to end the ground war exactly 100 hours after it had begun. On March 3, 1991, a ceasefire was declared. All told, the Gulf War was a colossal defeat for Saddam, forever marring his image on the world stage. But it was not the end, and he was more determined than ever to survive what happened next. Whilst the Gulf War undoubtedly weakened Saddam, the popular rebellion that followed almost toppled him completely. Within days of the ceasefire, revolts were springing up across Iraq. Groups who had languished under Saddam's thumb for decades sensed that this was their moment to rise up and destroy the regime, whilst it was still weak from fighting Bush's coalition. In the south, Shia militias joined with army deserters in a large-scale uprising, scattering Ba'athist forces in cities like Karbala and Najaf. In the north, the long-oppressed Kurds launched a campaign to free their cities and towns from Saddam's clutches. For the Kurds, memories of horrific chemical weapon attacks in the late 80s were still fresh, but this time they believed they had something that would tip the scales: the support of the United States. During the Gulf War, President George H.W. Bush repeatedly urged the Iraqi people to rise up and overthrow their dictator, creating an impression that any popular uprising would have American support. But with Kuwait liberated and their UN mandate fulfilled, the Americans wanted to avoid becoming entangled in an Iraqi civil war. The elite core of Saddam's army, the Republican Guard, regrouped and launched a counterattack against the Shia militias in the south. Although the coalition ceasefire imposed a no-fly zone over Iraq for fixed-wing aircraft, the agreement included an exception for helicopters. The Iraqi army exploited this oversight to devastating effect. Attack helicopters shredded the poorly equipped rebels, while tanks reduced buildings in Karbala and Najaf to rubble. In a matter of weeks, Saddam's troops had re-established control over the region. With the Shias broken, Saddam was free to turn his guns to the Kurds in the north. Faced with the full might of the Republican Guard, the Kurdish revolt collapsed. By early April, almost 2 million refugees were crashing like waves against the Syrian and Iranian borders. Ultimately, the 1991 uprisings failed, and Saddam Hussein had proven that on his home turf, no challenger could overcome his will to remain in power. The coalition forces remained on the sidelines during the Kurdish and Shia revolts, but Saddam soon found himself facing a very different kind of invasion. In the aftermath of the Gulf War, the UN passed Resolution 687, which required Iraq to unconditionally disarm and destroy all of its non-conventional weaponry and development facilities. To enforce this mandate, the United Nations sent a series of inspection teams into Iraq who scoured the country for chemical weapons. The Iraqi government's cooperation was made a prerequisite for the lifting of the crippling economic sanctions and removal of the oil embargo. Since the invasion of Kuwait, Iraq had been unable to sell its oil or even import basic agricultural supplies like fertilizer or pesticide. Disease and malnutrition were becoming rampant. Infant mortality was at its highest level in decades. Contrary to his nation's desire, Saddam stood defiantly against the UN. To him, the West sought to humiliate him, so he instructed his ministers to obstruct and deceive the UN weapons inspectors at every turn. For the next 6 years, the inspectors were led on one wild goose chase after another. For the Iraqi people, however, the suffering continued as a result of the economic sanctions. The UN did eventually introduce the Oil for Food program where Iraq was able to sell its oil in return for food and medicine. But this was not enough, and the country remained impoverished. Memories of a prosperous and thriving Iraq in the late 1970s seemed like a half-remembered dream, and most Iraqi children born in the 1990s entered a world of poverty, disease, and unimaginable privation. Saddam and his immediate family, on the other hand, managed to get even richer than before. Uday, in particular, was guilty of breathtaking displays of political corruption. The UN arranged for periodic sales of Iraqi oil so that the country could purchase essential supplies like medicine and food. Instead, the money was routinely diverted straight into the bank accounts of Iraq's ruling elite. At the turn of the millennium, Saddam stood defiantly against the international community. But then 9/11 took place and everything changed. The American public was furious and wanted revenge. And so began the War on Terror, which saw the USA invade Afghanistan in 2001. Saddam had very little connections with Islamic fundamentalists, but American foreign policy was blinded by rage. President George Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, who fought Saddam in the Gulf War, clumsily accused Saddam of a litany of crimes, including ties to militant Islamist organizations, as well as having weapons of mass destruction. Saddam had neither. But that did not matter. Due diligence was an afterthought for the Americans in the War on Terror. Revenge was priority number one.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
And so in March 2003, the US and its allied coalition invaded Iraq. Across a career that spanned almost 50 years, Saddam had skillfully survived political intrigues. This time, however, the writing was on the wall for him. Within 6 weeks, the Americans had triumphed as the Ba'ath Party was dismantled. Saddam went into hiding, hounded by the US military, which was on the hunt for top Ba'athist officials. In July, Uday and Qusay were gunned down. And after 10 months, the Americans discovered the fallen tyrant in December 2003 outside of Tikrit, hiding in a hole in the ground. He was made to stand on trial for crimes against humanity in front of an Iraqi court of law. Over the next 3 years, Saddam defiantly defended his actions as witnesses were brought out to recount the various crimes committed by him. In the end, he was unsurprisingly found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. And so Saddam's story ended on December 30th, 2006, on the day of Eid al-Adha. Today, Saddam's legacy has made somewhat of a resurgence. Many Arabs around the world hold him in high esteem, seeing the dictator as a strong leader who was capable of maintaining security and stability in his country. To be fair, if you look at the state of Iraq since he's been toppled, it's not hard to see why people think that. The country has been stuck in a cycle of violence and poor governance since 2003. Sectarian and ethnic tensions seem poised to slip Iraq into a civil war. The country's internal weakness leaves it vulnerable to interference from neighboring states like Iran. But Iraq's current state should not blind us from objective history. It is true, Saddam brought a degree of stability and even prosperity, with his remarkable achievements in the 1970s being a testament of that. But he also brought economic ruin to the country, arguably leaving it in worse shape than he found it in. Whilst the UN definitely deserves blame for maintaining the cruel sanctions, Saddam is equally, if not more, complicit in impoverishing millions of Iraqis. And for what reason? Your nation is descending into a hopeless pit of despair and destitution. But avoiding the humiliation of his government was more important to Saddam. Herein lies his biggest flaw. Saddam prioritized his own self-interests over that of Iraq. Yes, he was a strongman ruler who stabilized the country, but this stability was exploited to enforce his will over the Iraqi people. And as he consistently showed throughout his reign, his will was not directed by doing what was best for his people. Which is the job of a leader, to make decisions with the intention and hopefully end result of achieving what is best for your people. It's that simple.
Thank you guys for watching. I want to give a big shout out to Zach from Conflicted, a history podcast which goes into detail about interesting episodes of the past, such as the partition of India and the Afghan-Soviet War. As usual, thank you to my patrons for your continued support. Until next time, peace!